Welcome to Conversations in Tinnitus, a video podcast of the American Tinnitus Association. The American Tinnitus Association is a public charity under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, a charity dedicated to research, advocacy, education, and support for people living with tinnitus, including their families. Conversations in Tinnitus video podcasts reflect our mission to amplify the patient voice, showcase evidence-based and promising emerging treatments, and highlight cutting-edge research. All of this is made possible through your generous support. Thank you. Hi, welcome. My name is Patrick Lynch. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the American Tinnitus Association, the ATA. And today we're thrilled to be talking about the science of tinnitus in the field of tinnitus, and maybe even a little bit of the history of the ATA itself. We are honored today to be joined by someone who has worked closely with the ATA, co-founder Jack Vernon, Grant Searchfield. Grant is a trailblazing audiologist who has a passion for understanding how we hear and how we cope when our hearing goes awry. Grant has a master's in audiology and a doctorate from the University of Auckland, and he now heads the university's audiology department, and he co-directs the Isdell Moore Center for Hearing and Balance Research. Incredibly, that's not all. He's also the deputy head in the School of Population Health, a primary investigator in groundbreaking brain and medical tech research, and he's the scientific director of True Silence Therapeutics. Whether Grant is diving into the cognitive mysteries of tinnitus or innovating tech to manage hearing loss, he is all about making life sound better. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention he's the specialty editor for Frontiers in Audiology. And most importantly, we're proud to know that the ATA has funded some of Grant's research in the past, and he has been generous enough to donate his time and expertise to serve as a member of our scientific advisory committee, which oversees all of the research that the ATA funds every single year. So without further ado, Grant, I'd love to welcome you to the screen here. And thank you in advance for your time and all your service in all things tinnitus. Good to see you.
Great to see you, Patrick, and thank you very much for the nice introduction.
Of course, and we're just so honored to have you tuning in all the way from Australia. And so while we are the American Tinnitus Association, one thing we always like to say is tinnitus does not know boundaries, nor does science. So thank you for joining us across all the time zones as well.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. And, our summer down under, which is great here in New Zealand, summer down under. So we're looking forward to having a great chat today.
And I just realized I said Australia and not New Zealand. My apologies, good sir. All the way from New Zealand. I should know that. Lord of the Rings was New Zealand, correct?
It was.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You walk down the street and you bump into hobbits all the time.
I'm sure you do. Well, it's good to see you. So let's start off the conversation. So, I'm fairly new serving in this role as the CEO of the American Tinnitus Association. I'm still in my first year, and I myself, I consider myself a patient advocate in that I've suffered from tinnitus myself for over 20 years as a result of chemotherapy treatments as a teenager. So I have a personal attachment to the cause as well, but it's been really fascinating from my point of view, learning about all the different aspects and the different specialties that can really dig deep into some of the scientific sides of things. And of course, you know all of this way better than I possibly could. I'm curious. I know one of the things that drew me to tinnitus and the ATA was my own personal experience as someone who has tinnitus. I'm wondering for you, what first drew you into tinnitus? How did you get involved in sound therapy and tinnitus, and how did you know you wanted to make that a focus of your career?
Yeah, well, I have a little bit of tinnitus, but that probably wasn't the primary driver for me initially. What it was, as a new audiologist just out of a degree program, I was working at a major ENT hospital here in Auckland. And I would frequently see people for hearing tests. I would do the hearing test. And they would say, well, thanks for telling me about, my hearing and so on. But really what the problem I have is this sound in my head and in my ears. And they say, so what can you do about that? And we had a little bit of training in our audiology program, but really I didn't feel well equipped to be able to answer those sorts of questions. And so it was really about me then saying, well, look, if I'm going to be doing this job properly, I'm going to need to find out more about it. We had a local audiology journal club where we would share things. I started talking about tinnitus papers that I had read. And I had always had a fascination with research and wanted to do research. So that really was the catalyst for me engaging in the clinical research of tinnitus. And from that interest, it just really gathered momentum and saw me take up a greater focus on tinnitus. Yeah.
And it's been an incredible career ever since. I would love, one of the stories that we tell often from the ATA about the ATA is our founding. So I feel personally a very special connection to one of our co-founders, Charles Eunice, who was a patient who was suffering from tinnitus himself, and part of the story of our founding going back to 1971. Charles came across the path of a gentleman by the name of Jack Vernon, a researcher in the field out of Oregon at the time. And from their meeting, the ATA was born. So I have a connection to Charles just as a patient, but you have a much better connection because you actually knew Jack, our other co-founder, Jack Vernon.
Yeah,
Can you tell us a little bit about that, about both of them, and how you came across their paths and what that was like, those early days?
Yeah, so it was really good fortune, a lot of luck, I suppose. So I mentioned, beginning to take on this interest with tinnitus. And around about that time, the ATA co-hosted a international tinnitus conference in Portland in 1995, which is sort of showing my age now. And I was lucky enough to get some funding to go there. And I was introduced by our local New Zealand Tinnitus Association to Jack and Mary Meikle. And this was just awesome because I, of course, had read a lot of their papers, and I thought that was fantastic. I was a little bit starstruck, to be honest. But what amazed me was how interested they were actually in what I was doing. And I was somewhat flummoxed by that because I had seen these people in the literature, and I thought they wouldn't at all be interested in me. So that actually initiated a series of fortunate events in which I kept close contact with Mary and Jack. And just again, from another coincidence, it happened that back in New Zealand, I met and then married an Oregonian who lived in Salem, which is quite close to Portland. So there was there's a tale about how I went back to the States for my wedding, and I spent quite a lot of time at Oregon Health Science University with Mary and Jack. And look, they became very close friends of the family. We stayed on their guest houseboat. My oldest daughter got to meet and spend time with Jack and Mary. And so they became very close friends and mentors. And aside from, being leaders in the field, they taught me, I think, to try and engage with people and to be welcoming of new people in the field and try and facilitate interest in tinnitus. So I was very lucky through a number of events to engage there. And of course, we would have very interesting conversations over a cup of coffee, over dinner, about tinnitus. I learned a little bit more about those fateful days when masking was sort of rediscovered, or the real impetus became behind that. And I also had opportunities to meet up with ATA at that time, because at that particular point in time, they were based out of Portland. So whenever I came to Portland, I would try and organize a visit just to say hi.
And let me ask you about that. So you mentioned it just now in passing, masking. I haven't heard this story from the first person source. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that first tinnitus masking prototype and how that came about and what it actually was.
Yeah, well, the story goes, there's a particular fountain in Portland. For those that have been to Portland, Oregon, along the riverfront, there are lots of different fountains. That's one of the features there. And the story goes, I think it's the Lovejoy fountain, particular fountain, that Jack stopped there, and the individual you mentioned didn't want to leave the surrounds of the fountain, and exclaimed that, this was one of the first times in the last many years that they hadn't heard tinnitus. And while Jack wasn't really doing human-based research at that particular time, it clearly triggered this interest. And I think that the patent for the first tinnitus masker came about in 1979, 1980. So a relatively short period of time after that, where Jack was able, with his engineer colleagues, to fabricate effectively a mobile fountain, an electronic masker for the first time in that sense. And so that really began a resurgence in the interest in managing tinnitus. It coincided, of course, with the development of the ATA, because patient advocacy connection with individuals experiencing tinnitus was so important, and learning from people's experience. So these things happened, around about the same time, and grew out of that the foundation of one of the very first tinnitus clinics in the world. And about that time, there began international conferences, both in the United States and in the UK. These at that time, the numbers attending these meetings would have been, less than 15, 10 or so people who were the world researchers in tinnitus at that time. And there've been a number of publications, and if you ever get a chance to read some of these older publications, there's a lot of great knowledge in there, people's experiences, hypotheses. You can see where some of these sorts of ideas have gone. Some of them clearly dead ends, but others really have been the strong foundations of where we are and where we're moving from now.
It's fascinating to see the history and to know that the ATA was, really there at the beginning. A lot of this stuff with you and Jack and Charles, and the tinnitus masking prototype. I've heard the fountain story before. I've never heard it told from someone who has a first-hand knowledge of it. So that was really special for me to hear. Thank you. I'm wondering, as we're talking about this and the history of it all, obviously the field has changed quite a bit. The more we've learned, the more we've been able to fine tune things. From your point of view, from the early days, what do you think some of the most significant advancements that you've seen over the years?
Well, I guess fundamentally people are aware that, technology has developed a huge amount, right, over this period of time. So we now have tools that people like Jack would have loved to have had, and would have made his research stronger, and improvements would have been more rapid. So there, with the technology, I'm thinking about the sorts of things that we can do when we're trying to assess what tinnitus is. So brain imaging, MRI, electrical recordings of brain activity, EEG. Now the use of wearable sensors for heart rate and so on, that technology and miniaturization have enabled. And then we have the technology and the therapy aspect, where the first masker was an analog electronic device, and by that, what I mean is it had discrete electronic components that were wired in together, as opposed to now where it's largely software based. There's a computer chip that everything goes on to, which gives so much more flexibility. So we're able to do a lot more with the technology that we have at hand. If we look at the drug discovery area, yes, this has been a very slow and painful road in terms of trying to find a medication for tinnitus. But we're able to develop new candidate tinnitus treatments more rapidly, and our understanding of the targets for where these therapies should actually act are much greater. So there's a lot of this fundamental, but this doesn't change the fundamental research that was done. And what we see is this acceleration and our ability to try and extract information. Certainly there's still dead ends that come about where we're not so smart as to be able to say that we can come up with a surefire cure for tinnitus just yet, but we're making huge inroads. And I think that the latest, if you like, big change, and people will perhaps be a little bit skeptical about some of this sort of thing, but is AI. Because machine learning helps us discover things that we otherwise wouldn't see with our naked eye, with our own brains, its ability to gather data and sift through it.
That's an interesting point, the AI piece, right? Because whether you're, I'm a recovering attorney, I like to joke. So, even in the field of the practice of law, I'm reading articles about how AI can impact. I mean, I've read stories about attorneys that were using AI produced citations for cases that were not real, right? And then that attorney got in trouble. The technology is just advancing at a pace where it's impacting all of our fields, tinnitus included and sound therapy included. This is kind of a two-part follow-up question, I think, because you have a unique role also as a researcher in the field, and all of the researchers. Oftentimes, and forgive me for not having a better analogy here, but in law, oftentimes technology, or even in medicine, technology can vastly outpace the pace of the industry itself. I would imagine the same here is the true for sound therapy, where sometimes the technology is further ahead of maybe the research itself.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think if we look back to the 1980s as a starting point for this, really, the technology was a limiting factor, that the people had the ideas. The core comes from humans, and understanding and listening to tinnitus sufferers about their experiences, and those experiences haven't changed. But what has happened is this rapid growth in technology. But there is the gap between what potential is in knowing the question to ask. So we can ask, for example, and I'm sure people have done this, they've gone onto the internet and things like Chat GTP and thought, oh, this is cool. I wonder what I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask it a question just to try it and see what it will come out with. Now, there are so many questions that we could ask about tinnitus, and are we actually asking the right questions? So we sort of have to start from where we are and see if the tools that are available can help us extract that information. Once they've extracted that information, there are going to be a whole new series of questions that need to be answered, that we need to employ there. And AI, machine learning, buzzwords, everybody's onto it. It's everywhere. But we really are still at an early stage of understanding how to best use it. We could use it in a very scattergun approach, but we really, to get the most out of it, we have to have the questions that we want answered. And then we
Where
have
do
to
you
have
think some of those questions are headed? So the ATA takes pride. One of our missions as a charity, our overall mission is to silence tinnitus together, and we do that through three main silos. We help provide reliable information to patients and loved ones. We provide services like our 1-800 hotline and our website and our newsletter and our magazine. We try to educate professionals and providers on the front lines. But then the third silo of what we do is rooted in our research, and you've some of your research has been funded by some of our grants, and you've worked on our scientific advisory committee. So from a research angle, I'm wondering, what do you think? Where do you think the research is headed? What are some questions that really need to be answered now or in the near future?
Yeah. So, if we look at the frustrations that tinnitus sufferers have, right, and the big questions, right? Why isn't there a cure? Why has it taken so long to get to that point? Why does this treatment that other people say works for them doesn't work for the person experiencing it? And what the future holds, I think, and this is where AI enables this. It's not purely AI, it also involves our individual thoughts and so on, is our ability to personalize treatments and understand that we are all different. We all have very different tinnitus. We all have different physiological makeups. We have different experiences in life. And AI holds the potential to actually extract that information and guide us. So rather than saying, for everyone, this is the treatment, right? You have this treatment. This is what you have. This is what you have. Rather than taking that approach, we actually get closer to perhaps something that's closer to what you've experienced, Patrick. You've probably seen the development in terms of cancer medication, right? Where there is much greater tailoring, not only to the type of cancer, but also the individual physiology and reaction. Now, we're quite away from that, but the huge advances that have been made in cancer research have greatly been around recognizing that the cancers don't behave in the same way, right? And so tinnitus really doesn't behave in the same way for individual to individual. There are probably multiple different causes, very, very complex. And the ability to extract that information and then personalize the treatment really holds, I believe, the solution to the problem that we have. And
It's a
that,
really, really great analogy. And so, I have the distinction, I guess, in my personal life of being a three-time cancer survivor now, incredibly. And you're right. I just because of my personal experience, I pay close attention to some of the latest treatments and fads and talking points. And I would say over the last 15 years, we've been hearing a lot in the cancer field about the term of precision therapy. And the idea that you can fine tune down to the genetic level, ongoing managing treatment of cancer so that some cancers could be treated in the future the way diabetes is today, in theory. And so it makes total sense that tinnitus would be a similar situation, really all medicine, right?
yeah,
And so
absolutely,
do you think it's fair? Do you think it's fair to say that one of the roadblocks when it comes to tinnitus is funding of research, in that cancer, there's no shortage of money that gets poured into cancer research and the different types of cancers? Could one argue that not nearly as much money is being poured into tinnitus research, and that's affecting that?
Yeah, well, quite clearly, I think that the case with cancer, and perhaps we can understand why that receives so much attention. I think if we look, for example, also at child health, that probably, in different conditions receives a lot more funding. If we have a look at something perhaps that's analogous to tinnitus, a little bit more chronic pain, I think that the researchers in that space probably face many of the challenges that we do in tinnitus. But yes, very clearly, we are limited in the amount of research that we can do by the volume of funding. And that also, it's not just about those current researchers having lots of funding to do what they want. It's also about attracting other researchers into the field, right? And researchers that have perhaps been working on other areas, but would contribute an awful lot to our field. But there has to be opportunities. This is the reality. From a personal experience, I have a lot of PhD students and postdoc students coming through our lab, and we can't keep all these bright minds in our lab, and that's fair enough. But often they will migrate away from tinnitus research because simply there aren't those positions there for them. So that is a huge loss. So the advances in technology, great, but we still have to have that funding to enable that. ATA has done a great job at a number of different levels, looking at pieces of research that have great possibility and perhaps getting in there at an early stage to enable that, and then for the researchers to have that body of preliminary work to go to other larger funders and potentially bring that in. The other thing is getting new researchers into the field, right? So ATA at different times has had new investigator type of funding and support research. And then there's the advocacy for these sorts of things through being present at conferences and talking to individuals, the encouragement there. So yes, funding and good investment, right? Good investment and making sure that the money is well spent.
And that would be my role is to advocate for the ATA. We're proud to have something called our Scientific Advisory Committee, our SAC, which we lovingly refer to, and you've been a part of that. That helps oversee when we get a grant submission. There's a scientific rigor that goes along with that. That there's some scientific validity behind the ATA ultimately deciding to fund that grant. But that's of course why every organization from the NIH on down has their guidelines. That's of course the most important. If you had, one of the phrases I often use when I'm speaking with, whether it's a donor or a patient or even a researcher or an audiologist, what I often say about the ATA is, there's no shortage of what we want to do and what we should do or what we can do. No shortage. But we cannot give, the ATA cannot give what it does not have. But let's pretend for a minute that we had infinite resources and we were setting out a 5 to 10 year roadmap. What would you, from your point of view in your career, what would you hope to see in the next 5 to 10 years if resources were not constrained?
Wow, that's a big question. That would be a great question to actually have in reality, wouldn't it? I guess with infinite resources, your ability to test multiple medications. So in 5 years, you would have a number of potential new candidates for treatment. The ability to have multiple individuals, every city, every university in the world having a tinnitus department where the research was dedicated to tinnitus. Networking, a system in which clinicians around and researchers around the world were connected and sharing and not wanting to get dystopian, the idea of a central brain that was able to process all this data around that gets a little bit scary, because of course you want to have that
before long we'll have Skynet and Terminator coming down.
Exactly. I mean, I sort of that did pass into my mind when I mentioned that, but this idea of good investment, but also investment that takes risks, but educated risks, because science can be quite conservative and the process can be quite conservative. For example, when I mentioned, the drug discovery just now, I said, well, having a number of candidates for in 5 years' time. Why did I mention that? Is because the systems wouldn't allow that drug to be available for patients within 5 years, because it would have to go through a lot of regulatory testing and validation that it's safe and so on before, after that 5 years. So I think that the scientific advisory committees and like groups elsewhere in the world have a role in being able to say, look, this is valid. The researchers have got a good plan, but also be willing to take a little bit of a risk on some studies to advance the field. Quite often in conservative research funders, you almost have to have done the research in order to get the funding. It's sort of, you have to demonstrate that you're going to show what you want to show, which is a strange process. On the other hand, if you are you don't have any evidence, you don't want to throw money after something that's not going to work.
Chicken or egg scenario, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. So there is a sweet spot there where the process proposed has a lot of rigor. Perhaps it's quite innovative. It's novel. It hasn't been done before. That's perhaps where a proportion of funds can take risks to try and advance the field further. If you like, rather than playing with the ball and juggling it in your hands, actually throwing it, down the field and chasing after it. Let the question actually be a bit further out than our capabilities are at the moment, and we'll catch up to that. A little bit like you saying where the technology is. The technology's there, but are we asking the right questions and getting ourselves out beyond where we're comfortable? I think is really important.
Really, really great points. Thanks. There's a motivational speaker here in the U.S. His name's Simon Sinek. You might have seen some of his stuff online. He has a popular book that was rooted in a TED Talk he gave called "Start with Why," and he has a bunch of different anecdotes in this speech and in the book. But his overall point, which I use all the time, is whether you're a business or a public charity or a researcher trying to get funding, ultimately you have to understand. You can sit there all day long and say the what. I want to fund study ABC. It will have X amount of data and Y amount of results. Or you can start with the why, which is I want to research this idea that will change the world. And then you get into the what, right? And so when it comes to the ATA, what I found is we have stakeholders that have very different whys. Some of our stakeholders are patients and they just want a pill or a machine or a doctor to go to, whereas other folks are hyper interested in the next version of research. And then the folks who want to fund research, they like different types of research, which is what you were just talking about, right? There are seed grants, which we fund quite a bit of, that help establish some of that ground data to lead to the bigger grants. But then we have other folks who are interested in the large grants, translational research that costs millions of dollars a piece. And so it's interesting to think about it that way from my seat, the why behind research, because there are so many different types of research out there where you could go, and then making sure it's scientifically valid, that there's a reason to even put the money behind the idea in the first place, that there's some kind of form of checks and balances, I guess, to the study.
Yeah. And I think that, the concept of co-design is quite an important one there. That is that researchers may have capabilities or knowledge, right? They have the ability to do these sorts of things. But talking with patients, what does this mean to you? If I solve this problem, would it do anything? Is it meaningful? Understanding what the problems are. And then there's also the reverse. So as you mentioned, a lot of tinnitus patients understandably want a cure, and they're interested in the primarily drug research, right? And they're not so interested in what people perhaps like me primarily focus on, which is trying to improve tinnitus life. We do a little bit of drug research, but not that much. And so it's a mutual understanding that each of these different groups and focus does have its place. I think that I've been criticized by some patient advocates because I'm researching sound therapy and I'm interested in improving that, and I'm not focusing on drug therapy. But that's not where my skill is.
Of course.
Right?
And sound therapy, we know today, is effective. We have the tools, and a lot of these tools. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that. Maybe we could talk a little bit about specific tools when it comes to sound therapy and things that are available today that we know work.
Yeah. So what is sound therapy? There's a starting point, and that can be debated as well. And my definition that I use, it's fairly straightforward one. It's when sound is used as a therapeutic mode of trying to assist tinnitus. Now, typically when that is done in the clinic, there are other things that are done alongside of that to try and augment it, supplement it, fill the gaps that sound therapy doesn't do. Fundamentally, at the root of sound therapy is masking. Now, when I say that, people will say, I don't do masking, or you shouldn't do masking. The reality is, from a psychoacoustic point of view, when you play a sound, even if your goal is not to cover the tinnitus, you have begun a process of psychoacoustic masking. So fundamentally, that is at the core. Now, there are lots of ways that sound can be used. One is to totally mask the tinnitus, and this is where Jack began. And that can provide effective relief. But most people will not use the sound at that level. So we talk about partial masking or mixing. And mixing is psychoacoustically a form of masking. We can use sound rather than to provide relief, to provide relaxation, to reduce some of the symptoms associated with tinnitus. So we can reduce stress, we can perhaps aid breathing, it can be used to supplement mindfulness types of approaches, those sorts of things, to bring the level of stress down. And then there is trying to modify the tinnitus itself, the tinnitus sound. Now, this is the difficult part, modifying the perception of tinnitus. And that's where a retraining modification reliant on brain plasticity, the brain's ability to change, becomes very important. And that can be done in multiple ways. And I guess when we were talking before about asking the right questions for the solutions, that area there is the one that's most ripe for discovery, in that we have lots of opportunities to try different things. And so when we're using sound there, fundamentally what we're trying to do is essentially change the weighting that the brain plays on the tinnitus signal, how important it is. And can it be pushed into the background where it's effectively limited? Sometimes the term habituation is used for a relearning process. It's not necessarily that, it's actually the mechanism behind this. There's a lot of emerging evidence that what we're actually doing is rewiring the brain. That may be related to habituation, but these are real changes in the communication and the function of the way that the brain works together. It's not killing brain cells. What it's doing is it's changing, it's helping the brain learn. So when we learn from an early age, what we're doing is we're connecting neurons And, if you something wires and fires together, then they connect. And so if you're walking, all right, well, one of the first tasks that we often get excited about is when our children get up and stand and walk. And what's happening there is their brain is firing and connecting and changing to enable them to do that. So sound therapy, in a retraining point of view, is changing those connections to try and enable relearning. And through that learning, irrelevant inputs, irrelevant activity can effectively be suppressed or turned off, lost, right? If you're not using something, you're doing something, those connections get taken over by something else because the brain wants to use them, right? If we're immobile, if we haven't played tennis for 20 years and we try and use that, we've lost some of the connections that enabled us to do that. And so sound therapy can achieve each of these different things potentially if done in the right way. Still a lot of discovery about how we tune that to the individual. I think you might be, your mic might be off there.
Gosh, I'm mute. I'm talking to myself out loud here. I was on mute. I apologize. And that touches to a lot of the other things we were talking about: funding research, science, keeping up with the technology, folks being open to new ideas and funding some of these new ideas. Your analogy there to tennis is pretty good. I recently experienced an accident. I broke my ankle, and had some surgery on my ankle, and was immobile for a little while. Turns out even a little bit of immobility on your leg is pretty serious just for your muscle atrophy alone. It's incredible how quickly the body can change based on lack of use of a thing. And the same would be true for the brain. So sound therapy obviously is that for the brain, right? And I think it's important sometimes for us to have patience with the fact that when it comes to tinnitus, there's no one size fits all treatment, and there will never, I shouldn't say never, but there likely may not be a moment where you take one pill and it is over. It's very likely that things like habituation, exercise, integration of therapies and lifestyles are a part of treatment. And that's what sound therapy is. Are there today, based on the options that are out there, are there options available to folks who may not have access to a professional in their neighborhood or in their vicinity for something like a behind the ear noise masker or a hearing aid? Where can folks look?
Yeah. Well, I think that the COVID epidemic taught us a lot in the clinical space, that we can do a lot remotely. And there's been a big move to trying to democratize healthcare. And one of what we mean by that is to make it easier to access, both from a cost perspective, but also simply from where you are in a country. And obviously, United States, big country, big rural areas, for example, your ability to connect up with experts. So that can be done through, the sort of self-help type of thing where you can use apps. Generally, apps haven't been scientifically shown to provide benefit. They haven't been shown not to provide benefit. They just haven't necessarily been tested. But I think that a lot of treatments are looking at how you capture the best of a clinician, the skills that the clinician can provide, but also facilitate the individual taking on that role themselves. And I guess this is an area of interest to myself, and something that commercially we've been pursuing. So I think that there are more and more different options. And one of the things that you mentioned there, Patrick, was around multiple options. One of my key sayings in my talks to clinicians is, when you're with a patient, be pragmatic, not dogmatic.
Mm.
That is, if you only provide one philosophy of treatment, it's not going to work for everyone, and no matter how often you say something, it's still not going to work for that person. So we strongly believe in patient-guided therapy, and that they're identifying what the problems are that they're having, and then you can tune your treatment to that. So really, clinicians should have a number of tools in their toolbox. As we move forward, you're quite right in this combination of things. You mentioned, will there be one drug? Well, there may not be one drug. Maybe there's multiple drugs. For an individual, there's one drug, but for another person, maybe there's another drug. Maybe it's going to be the use of that medication and sound therapy, because maybe the medication is going to be activated, turned on by the sound, or maybe the sound therapy is turned on by the drug being there. We've tried a few initial experiments where we've given drugs and then different sound therapies to see if we can enhance those. So I think the idea between taking multiple therapies and looking at them in combination, and what this requires is collaboration, right? Because I'm not a pharmacist.
This is a big one.
Yeah,
Collaboration's a big one.
it's a huge one, right? Because I'm not a pharmacist. I'm not a dispensing doctor. So whenever I do drug research, right, it's actually quite difficult for me as an individual, as an audiologist, to, even as a researcher, professor in audiology, to do that. I need these other folks to come on, and it's sort of coming a full circle. How do we get other people into this field that are doing this? Well, we have to have the funding, we have to have the encouragement. Tinnitus patients have to advocate, and they also have to support. So rather than saying, for example, you're not doing research in the area that I want, what they should be doing, saying, is going to people that are doing research in the area that they think should be doing tinnitus and saying, hey, you should be doing tinnitus research. So encouraging rather than, being a bit
positivity point of view, and being an active part of it. I love that point, and I have a previous life, and unfortunately not just in law but in politics. And in politics, oftentimes I've served on campaigns, I've served with staffers, I've worked as a fundraiser for politicians, and oftentimes a politician would say, they'd get a call from a constituent, and they would ask the constituent, there's a pothole on my street. What are you going to do about the pothole? And of course, it's the politician's role to try and find a solution. But President Kennedy in the U.S. is famous for having said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And I find that analogy is true whether you're a politician trying to enable a constituent, or you're a researcher in tinnitus, or a nonprofit like the ATA. The more involved and engaged you can be in a solution, the more empowered you'll feel. So if you're a prospective donor, to a charity, I think it's always important for a donor to think of themselves as an investor. You wouldn't buy a piece of stock in the stock market if you didn't think it was a good investment of your money. Well, the same is true for a charity, or for a cause, or for a candidate. You want your gift, or your money, or your actions to go towards something you believe is going in the right direction. And oftentimes actions can speak louder than words. So that's a good point to make, that if you believe in something, get your actions behind it, get your money, if you can, behind it, your support behind it. The other analogy I have there is, if a politician were to get, there's a guy I worked for, he would tell this story. If when he was a state senator, if he got one phone call from a constituent, he knew there was an issue. If he got 2 phone calls, he knew it was an issue that people were talking about. And then he would say, if he got 5 calls on one issue, it was as large as a trailblazing fire, just from 5 phone calls. And his point being, what you may think is not a big deal actually can be a big deal. And whether it's $5, $500, whether it's 1 phone call or 5 phone calls, the more people who get on board, you really can make a difference. All of us can make a difference here.
Absolutely. And I think there's also strongly believe there's a responsibility of researchers to get into their communities and talk about what they're doing and listening. I'm lucky to have been invited, throughout New Zealand to small communities to give public talks. I really enjoy that. I get to talk about what I do. Who doesn't enjoy doing that? But also it's about hearing individuals' own stories, own experiences, what's worked for them, how their tinnitus developed, what their problems are, their priorities. And through this, we will have quite often shaped what the questions that we've been asking ourselves. This is a priority for a number of people. We hadn't thought that would be. Here's a great thing that we can do that's going to make a difference. And sometimes the goals are lofty, like the drug discovery, but sometimes they're quite achievable. I would like to be able to find information reliable, quicker. How do I know that this is good? These sorts of things, very achievable things, but they're causing problems for the individual. Or I go and talk to my family doctor and they really don't know about tinnitus. Well, that's in many ways responsibility for academics like myself to try and advocate for more teaching and medical programs about tinnitus and so on. So this isn't a one-directional thing. It's not even bi-directional. There's different components all over the place and connecting and going round and round. It's really the community, the overall network that is going to solve the problems that we have, and we need to work together. The funders, the advocacy groups, the researchers, the patients, the tech companies, the drug companies, we all have to play our parts. And sometimes there are barriers there that might seem unsurmountable, but actually if you get a chance to talk to the individual that is the individual you need to talk to, once you have a conversation about a lot of those barriers that seem to be there, just
they break down pretty quickly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Relationships are key in all of this. I think one of the roles that I think the ATA can play is providing that platform for all these different stakeholders. And it's my hope that we continue to grow that platform. And I'll say again, we cannot give what we do not have, but we want to give a lot. And I think there's a real opportunity here for all of us to come together as the community and do our part, because the common denominator here is there are a number of folks who all recognize tinnitus is an issue and that it's a solvable issue on a lot of fronts. The only thing handicapping us is our resources and time. Time, talent, and treasure maybe is a better way to phrase that. But really starting with our why. How do we silence tinnitus? So you're certainly an example of that, going all the way back to our foundation. Thank you for sharing everything you have about the ATA's history, sound therapy, and where you think this all might be headed. Let me ask you, is there anything we haven't talked about in the last 45 minutes or so that we haven't mentioned that maybe we should? At this point, if someone's still watching us talking 50 minutes in or so, they obviously are a stakeholder in the topic. What if there was one parting thing you'd want to share with the audience? What would it be that we haven't said yet?
Yeah, well, I think we've touched on it, but it is hope.
Yeah,
I think, and also some solace that people are working very hard. You don't necessarily see them in the headline news. You don't necessarily hear about them in media, but there are lots of people that are working very hard in their own way, in their own areas of expertise to try and come up with different solutions. So I think, there are a number of ways that people, if they have tinnitus now, there are great improvements that can be made. The elimination of tinnitus, is the difficult one, and that is not impossible. It's out there, and we have to strive to get there. But also understanding that while there may not be a cure or cures for tinnitus, let's say we can reduce your tinnitus by half. A lot of people would love that, right? And a lot of current therapies can do that. More than half.
Wow.
Can we cure? No, there are the odd person where tinnitus seems to go away. Great. And we have to be careful about what we do. But let's just say, you could reduce your tinnitus by half. For those people that do desire a cure and are totally focused on that, it's a great end goal. But in the interim, would a halving help you? And I think a
I
lot of
love
people
that.
would say absolutely.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I think that people should consider those therapies and those solutions that are out there now, and the benefit that they may get, weigh that up, and knowing that the hope that people are working for that ultimate. We are trying to get there.
And you're at the forefront of that, and you have been for decades. So thank you, Grant, for your time. I love the idea of us ending on hope. I hail from the great state of Rhode Island. I was born and raised there, and the state motto for Rhode Island is hope. So that's pretty perfect.
Yeah.
Thank
I
you
did
for
not know
everything
that,
you
by
do.
the way, for
Oh
people
well,
listening in.
I taught.
That was not a
There we
part of
go.
the answer. So
All
that's great.
right.
Yeah.
Well,
No, I think
well, you and
that's
I
yeah.
will be in touch. If maybe I think it would be helpful if we maybe touch base every now and then online in a format like this. And I think folks just love hearing from folks like you, and you certainly have such an important perspective and expertise here. So thank you for your time and everything you do. And I can't wait to run into you again soon.
Well, hopefully we will. And yeah, thanks to those people that have waited to the very end and
Yes.
appreciate that. And I also appreciate their experiences and the difficulties that they face. And we are trying to come up with really, really good solutions.
Thank you, and thank you for helping us get there. And for those of you who are listening who feel that way, please know you're not alone. Organizations like the ATA exist for this reason. You can visit ata.org, or you can call our 1-800 hotline if you have questions or concerns here in the U.S. You can always call us anytime at 1-800-634-8978. But there are lots of other folks and organizations around the country and the world who are there with you, whether it's an incredible researcher like Grant, a nonprofit like the ATA, or a local audiologist or an ENT. There are folks out there, and there are arguments to be made that there are as many as between 50 and 70 million folks in the U.S. alone who have some kind of tinnitus. So you are not alone. There is hope. And Grant, thank you for being a part of our hope today. We'll talk
Thank
real
you very
soon.
much for having me, and
All right.
always enjoy speaking with the ATA.
Thank you. Please consider a donation today.